Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. I've realized that I am actually a cat dreaming I'm a man. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. It's all, it's all dreams and nightmares going through. And I said, and meta moments of reliving things. As I say, this episode we're doing something a little different. We never did this before. In the last episode, we watched Open Your Eyes, the Spanish film, and in this episode, we have watched and we are going to discuss Vanilla Sky, the American remake by Cameron Crowe from 2001. So it's I was going to say a very similar film. It's the same film. It's a remake. For Western audiences, or at least English-speaking audiences. So, on that front, Julian, what were your initial thoughts of Vanilla Sky?
In the past, I would have said that Abre los Ojos was slightly better than Vanilla Sky. Now I think Vanilla Sky is superior. We talked before about how Abre los Ojos was a little flat and sort of not emotionally engaging. I was not just emotionally engaged, but fucked up by this movie. Yeah. And we'll go into it in some depth, but I mean, this movie is like, I have a list of just like themes that it's like, this is a reflection of my life. It is like a piece of cinema designed to take a scalpel to Julian's brain. So what were your first reactions?
No, I struggle to say which one's superior, and I think I have a decision. However, I had I had a weird like meta moment with this film because it's so similar to Open Your Eyes, in that I was watching moments of this film, sat in the same place in the same room, on the same day of the week, watching this film, and there's moments, and I'm like, yeah, this feels like some glitch in the Matrix, like some weird deja vu, because there are scenes that are very, very similar. It does have that thing. However, one of the things is there are moments of this film that are superior to Open Your Eyes, and there are things that I think are inferior to Open Your Eyes. And as a whole, I'm not yet sure, and I think this discussion will probably help me come to that conclusion. I definitely felt more engaged with this one on a character basis. This isn't a language barrier thing. This is more about me engaging with the characters and the story, and there's a reason for that we'll get into. However, there are other things tonally that sort of didn't quite work, or work better, I think, in Open Your Eyes. However, before we get into all that, let's give you a very brief plot, because you should know the story by now. If you've been listening along, you should have listened to for the last week. However, there's some slight changes. Life is good for David Ames. I'm not even reading this one. I'm going to remember it. Life is good for David Ames. He is the owner of 3 magazines and is incredibly rich because of both his father's wealth that he's inherited and this massive company. Firstly, the idea in 2021 that you can own 3 magazines and be this wealthy is laughable. So, how things have changed in 20 years. David goes from bed to bed and woman to woman and party to party. He's a bit of he's a Lothario and a playboy. And he has been having an on-off fuck buddy relationship with Giuliani, played by oh my god, leggy blonde, which is terrible to say. Cameron Diaz, thank you.
Yeah.
And he also
Cameron, leggy blonde. Yeah. God.
Yeah, David Ames, played by Tom Big Grin Cruise.
Yes.
And he's also joined by one of his close and best friend, who is writing a novel, and his novel is being paid for by Ames, played by Jason Lee. Into this mix, Jason Lee presents his friend, or woman he meets in the library, Sophia, again played by Penelope Cruz. Ames falls for Sophia on the spot, and they share a night of, well, intellectual compatibility. They meet and they share a moment, and as the film sort of says it, a moment in which they believe that true love could be possible. And at the end of that night, they have not slept together. They've just shared a simple kiss. And Ames leaves to find Juliana sat outside in her car. She has been following him, and this is where it starts to vary in certain areas. Feeling bad and guilty for the way he has treated her, Ames gets in the car to sort of go with her. However, it transpires that Juliana confesses that she is actually in love with David and has been done, and is brokenhearted to know that he has been going off with another woman. In a moment of passion and rage, and a fight between the two of them, she drives her car off a bridge just outside Central Park, killing herself and disfiguring Ames. Ames goes into a coma, and eventually when he comes out after reconstructive surgery, he has troubles facing up to the world. He suffers from psychological damage as well as physical disability. He's lost the use of his arm and sort of cannot look at himself in the face. Eventually, he is able to go and see Sophia and arranges for them to go and have a night at a disco. They go to the disco, and much like in the other film, it goes badly, and Sophia leaves him at the end of the night. However, he pictures that she has gone off with his best friend, and in his rage, may have done something daft. However, he wakes up the next morning to find that Sophia is waiting for him, and they have a torrid and whirlwind love affair in which they love each other wildly. Other things go on eventually until one night they're sharing. He wakes up, sees his own face as it was, and also sees that the bed is now being populated by Giuliani, who he believes was dead. It's all the same. This is where he eventually kills her, and we now know there's a mystery. And so, is it a dream? Is it a reality? We'll get into all of this. It's exactly the same plot in many, many ways. There's certain things I didn't mention, but we'll get into those details, as you said, that vary. So, now that we've got the plot out of the way, let's talk about this film. From the opening shot, before it was Madrid. Now it's Times Square, New York. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's much more creepy. I mean, and I don't think just because I'm an American to see the streets of New York empty and then Times Square empty.
It's much more affecting because it's like Madrid is a known Spanish city, but internationally, like New York, those iconic billboards sort of doing their thing, but no one around. I'm sure there was a lot of people that must have been very disrupted to make these shots. What's interesting as well, though, I find, because it's nowhere else in the film, is that in that scene, and I don't think this may not mean anything, because I was looking for things, but in that scene, David is driving a Ferrari, a 1960s Ferrari. But when he comes to, because it is a dream, when he wakes up, he's actually driving a 67 Mustang, which is an American car. So I didn't know if that was a sort of a note to European, its origins. I didn't know, but it was. I noticed it.
Yeah, there are some weird things like that that are sort of. I feel like they're there that Cameron Crowe sort of like put them in case you want to go deeper. There's a scene where he's talking and another person with a mask walks through the background.
Yeah.
And then I think there's it's like little things like there's a sticker on the car that says February 30th, that it's like, haha, if you want to believe that it's a dream, here it is. So, I mean, I think these are sort of Cameron Crowe sort of adding layers for those who want to go to that depth and find that interesting.
Okay, so there are those things. So I was looking for things like that, and there's a couple like that where you can say, like, is it like an Inception thing where you can tell this bit is the dream and that sort of thing. The thing is, like you say, there are moments in this, and we'll get to it later on, when I'm not. It's no spoiler. We know that at some point this thing splices, and in Open Your Eyes, it's less obvious.
Mm-hmm.
In this, there is they even there's a sound in the audio design that sort of is like a tape being spliced and edited and wound on, and it's like, okay, like, that's a weird sound to have at that moment. So,
well, I think that what's going on with sound in this film is incredibly impressive. Partly it's because it's got all of these American songs in it. It's got, REM, it's got the Beach Boys, it's got, a lot of great, it's got Peter Gabriel, it's got these kinds of iconic songs that stick with you. But also there's a lot of like overlapping that's being done, or orchestral music mixed with sort of, very much that sort of like wall of sound, Pet Sounds idea with, as he sort of realizes toward the end, like, this is all a fantasy and is crying for tech support. I mean, you get these kind of like sound collages, and I think the sound in this film really sets it apart from the previous one. And I think in a good way, even though, you can argue it's too obvious.
I am going to argue something on that. And it's not about, because I do agree that the sound design in this film is actually really good, because I think it also uses moments of silence, like dead silence, like really well, at several occasions. It's not so much the use of music; it's the use of these songs, and it feeds into the tone of this film that I think I have a bit of a problem with, or at least I struggle with. With Open Your Eyes, it felt like we said it was dark. Like, it felt like a descent into madness. Like, when you see that, what's he called in that film? The main characters, when you see him, he's disfigured and stuff, and you see that that resentment and bitterness and everything starts to come out. Like, it feels dark, and the film is dark, and it has those moments. Like, all the light starts to go away, and then when he goes to see Sophia in that film in the park, it's raining, and it's sort of like, again, like, it's this sort of all reflective of the mood the film's supposed to be. This film never has that. It's sort of like you say, it's got Beach Boys and these songs that are constantly upbeat, and the film's always sort of like, it's set in the autumn and into the winter, at least at the beginning, but it still feels the sun is still bright and there's never overcast, because I know it's supposed to be like Vanilla Skies, that's the point, but it never feels tonally the horror's the thriller or suspenseful or sort of like that. That sort of element is gone a little bit.
I think that's one reason why when I was younger I liked the Spanish one better. Besides that, I like the actor who played Cesar better, and he's more unlikable than Tom Cruise will let himself. I mean, to me, that sort of strikes me as a difference between Amenabar and Cameron Crowe. I mean, Cameron Crowe is coming off of like Almost Famous. He's selling this to a American audience. I know what you're saying about the music, that the music, it is more upbeat and it does sort of tell you how to feel, right? I mean, that's part of the point of cinema music. Peter Gabriel is like the ultimate, making a romantic connection song, right?
Yeah.
I will say for the Beach Boys song, I mean, I do like the Beach Boys, and for the Beach Boys song, that song is used ironically. So it's like I'm picking up good vibrations as there's nothing but bad vibrations going on. It's like the sound of insanity. So I mean, I like when songs are used ironically. Sort of Clockwork Orange-esque juxtapositions.
I would say it works at that point towards the end, like you said, when it becomes manic almost. And I get that, because it has that manic feel to it. Like there's an energy, but it's almost like a pent up, kind of thing. To like say, but there's other parts of the film where it's just sort of like it just comes across as cheery, and I'm like, I shouldn't be feeling cheery. So
Yeah.
that's it's a minor quibble in grand scheme of things, but it does sort of like it played a part into where I'm like, there's something sort of missing from this film, or at least it doesn't. There's a sort of an off-key choice, let's say.
And I know what you mean, and I don't disagree with it. Having said that, in the long list of things that are very minor that I think this film does do better, there are a few things that I think are worse. But one of the things that it does is suggest that this fantasy world after the splice is made up of things from his childhood and things, that he cobbled together in this sort of like Wizard of Oz-esque way. So you have like the snowboarding, but you have a lot of popular culture, which I have a sort of odd feeling about, because it's kind of sad to me the degree to which we define our lives by things we have nothing to do with and think we know these celebrities and stuff like that. But this is also much more the soundtrack of my life. Peter Gabriel, there's at least a couple REM songs in there. I mean, REM was incredibly important to me. And so, this strikes me as, having more of that emotional resonance, for me as an American of a certain generation when this came out.
No, I can agree with that. And the music feels very timely. And very American, like it's Americana. And as you say, I love that moment at the end when the tech support is explaining to him, like, well, no, you populated this with moments from your life, and they explain things like, here's a father figure that you sort of like you've cobbled together from these sort of like this ideal that you have, or an album cover that you
album cover is it the freewheeling Bob Dylan?
Yeah, that you've replicated in this sort of thing. It's clearly touched you, the snowboarding, all this stuff. Like all of that was like is a really cool idea that isn't in the other film. Like this, that thing of like, oh no, yeah, this is all in your head. Like there's no one else to blame for this, but like everything else is this ideal that you've sort of created. That idea is really good. But the use of the music I think is conflicting for me. Let's talk about the cast. Because I'm curious as how's your feelings about this. There are 4 main characters. Well, there's actually more, but we've got to talk about Tom Cruise.
Yes, let's go through
as David Ames. What are your feelings about Tom Cruise? This is prime time or prime A. This is top level Cruise. He was sort of this is following on from sort of Jerry Maguire, Magnolia, Eyes Wide Shut. So he's riding high. So what are your thoughts of him in this film?
I think that Tom Cruise can carry a film. I don't think he is. I mean, I don't like the Mission Impossible films, and he's done a lot of things, and he's attracted to things that I don't like. I think that I certainly love Magnolia and Eyes Wide Shut, but I think that he comes across as kind of hollow and mugging for the camera at times. I think he does a fine job. I think this is a fine performance overall. There are shots where I think, we're getting a good performance out of Cruise. But then there are other shots where, it often happens where nobody's around, where like he's looking in the mirror after the dream of having gone to the mirror and him still being facially disfigured. He wakes up, he goes back to the mirror, and he sort of like mugs and makes faces for the mirror. And I think, I get that it doesn't feel like a Curb Your Enthusiasm moment where you see that and you think, oh yeah, that's a thing we all kind of do sometimes and you never see in cinema. It feels like it's Tom Cruise mugging for the camera.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
No, I know what you said about those smaller moments like that. I think this is perfect for Cruise because he is hollow. However, and I think where we said about Cesar in the last film, like doesn't really have an arc. Like, it always, the whole film seems about his vanity, about his sort of bitterness at having something taken from him. This film feels different. Like there's something more to it. And that character, it almost feels a little bit like, I said, not so much Christmas Carol, but it has that sort of thing of like, being given the opportunities. But there's sort of like the Cruise, the Ames you meet at the beginning, David Ames before the accident. It feels like Cruise being Cruise. Like he's being charming and he's sort of like doing his thing and sort of like, and when he meets Sophia, like it feels there's definite chemistry between him and Penelope Cruz, and she's wonderful again. Like she's clearly, like, it's no surprise having watching these films back to back why she had such a career after this films. That like they have chemistry. So when they have that night where they're talking and that sort of thing, like when I watched it in Open Your Eyes, there was, I asked you, I was like, I'm not entirely sure what she saw in him. Like there's moments of it, but he always felt like he was acting, like it was a play to get something. Like it never felt like he legit in that night was changing for her. But with Cruise, there's something there where sort of like I'm not gonna say it's more subtle, but like I feel like that moment that night with Sophia changes him, like legit changes him. Where he's like, oh, actually, this woman makes me want to be a better person. Like, like me being with her is good for me. And like when he talks about like him and his best friend, like again, it's in Open Your Eyes. He's like, yeah, he's my best friend. That's why I'm not going to tell him. It's not. Yeah, I'm not going to hurt him. What he doesn't know won't hurt him. In this, it's almost like he justifies it a bit more. It's still like a dick move, but he's like, yeah, look, he met you today, and to be fair, he probably would do the same thing, and I'll probably let him do it. Like, yeah, he's a good guy, but this is what's happened. And so when it sort of like falls apart, like I feel more, that there's more lost than I do in the other film, and so I sort of sympathise with him more in this one, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, to your point, Cruise has lines that say, like, I regret getting in that car, both at the end and when he's talking to Sophia. And that's something that we don't really see in the other film. So it's not much of a character arc, but it's there. If I mean, and I agree with you that it does seem like that night affected him, which helps explain why he would craft a fantasy that is so close to Sophia, to make her be sort of the one that got away.
Yeah, well, she legit feels like the one that got away in this film. In the other film, it felt, we were saying like, well, he was only with her for a couple of hours. Like, why would he be so fixated on it? It doesn't make any sense. With this one, I'm like, I get it. Like, I understand. Like, this feels like transitional moment for him in his life. And mainly because of like, one of the things that's interesting about this film as well, which we'll get to, is the external pressures that they've put on him that was sort of alluded to in Open Your Eyes, but are clear in this film. I
think that's another thing this does better, right? It's,
much better, much
Dwarves,
better. Yeah,
the board.
And another thing, Seven Dwarves, linking it again with the main. So he's Snow White, going into sort of a dream. Anyway, so yeah, I think Cruise works well in this. There is that thing of him not being as unlikable, but the thing is about him not being as unlikable as Cesar is, when they're when the thing with Cesar being unlikable is like, I never sort of felt that night had an impact on Sophia. So why did it matter? Like, it should have been that change. So if so for him to be less unlikable, yeah, he's a playboy. He knows he's got but he feels like a legit friend to Jason Lee as well. Like they've got interplay, where he says to him he's paying him to do this novel, and sort of they joke about him saying like, I don't have to be the one to tell you, you're not ugly, sort of joking about it, sort of like, yeah, you're gonna get someone. It feels like friends bantering to an extent. And so I can sort of relate to what's going on, where it felt colder in the other film.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. There are moments where, I mean, Jason Lee sort of reminds me of, I think about him in sort of silly comedies and sort of, he feels like
Yeah.
a character out of a Kevin Smith movie.
Yes.
And that's sort of distracting. There are moments where I think I'm not in love with his performance when he's finally he's yelling at David Ames after Ames has been released. There are moments where I'm conscious of him as an actor in a way that I should not be.
Yes,
Having
I
said
agree.
that, yeah, I mean I think that's part of why this is a warmer film, that you can sort of identify with its characters. Even Cameron Diaz is more clearly crazy, right? She's got
Yes.
a crazier edge to her
Yeah.
than the actress did in Obre los Ojos.
Well, she's another. I mean, I agree what you're saying about Jason Lee. Like he is playing, Brody from Mallrats to almost. Do you know what I mean? Like he's playing that character. So I'm like, yeah, I get why you were in this role. You're the best friend. Like if this was a rom-com, like yes, you're the best friend character. You're the quirky best friend character. And so he sort of falls into role, but he does. He feels almost. There are moments when it's again. This is where I feel the film has like two halves, and it does because there's a literal splice in it. But like when it's all the fun and sort of like the bantering at the beginning, even the party when he meets Sophia and Jason Lee comes in and he's been drunk and he's a bit sort of like put out by it all, I'm okay with all that because it feels very much there's a rom-commy edge to it, of that tone. You know what I mean? It's still fun, it's still playing around with that. And so, this film could have gone in a very different direction. Like this could have gone sort of Four Weddings and a Funeral, or sort of like, The Holiday, or one of those films. And so, I'm fine with that character. It's like you say, it's when it becomes dramatic towards the end, like say when he's facing up to David Ames, and also when they're at the disco, that it feels a little bit where I'm like, oh yeah, you're not ready for this kind of dramatic acting. Like it feels like an actor acting. So I agree.
I very much agree.
Yeah. Cameron Diaz scares me a little bit in this film. Like, yeah, like we said it in the film about like and I hate the phrase to a little bit, but like bitches be crazy is sort of like what this sort of film says. Like, she plays that sort of manicness so well that I'm almost like I wish you'd had more villain roles at some point. Like, you would have been amazing as a really good baddie. Yeah, but you also yet again when she's giving that talk to David Ames in the car, like David, what is happiness to you? Like she is proper. Like she's stalking, and she's obviously got some, let's say psychological hang-ups, but like she is broken-hearted, and so it doesn't just feel like she's evil or crazy. Like she's playing it more manic, but like. It's coming from a place of like frustration and rage and brokenheartedness that I think like comes across much clearer in this film than the other film.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that very much, and I think that it's another minor change. But as she's having that conversation in the car about sort of what is happiness to you, as she's about to attempt a murder-suicide, she gets him. He's sort of saying anything to get her to stop, and he says, "I love you," and it's at that point that she accelerates. So there is this sort of, in the Spanish version, it's just she's the crazy girl who is going to do this. Here, it's almost as if he's played some part by everything he's doing to get her to stop is actually encouraging her. And she wants to die with that feeling of being with him and hearing those words, hearing "I love you." And so I that is a very minor change, but I thought that was very effective and further kind of, you can see why he would feel guilty. Like what she wants to hear is "I love you." It's hard to not sympathize with that, and at the same time, you can understand why he would feel guilty, not only because of that, but because him saying that was the final trigger to press that accelerator.
Yeah, and I like that because I mean, you can read it a sort of couple of ways, but it felt like him saying that, and she reads it as in desperation. Like it's not sincere. Like she knows it's not him saying, yeah, no, I legit love you, whatever. Because he gets into the car and he is talking to her like a buddy, like. But he's like, yeah, no, I didn't do anything last night, but there was a single kiss, and sort of like he's laughing it off. Like he legit sees them as friends.
Mm-hmm.
And she's the one that's going like, no, like you made, us sleeping together that 4 times, crossed some sort of emotional boundary. And so, what
it's a little crazy.
Yeah, but that moment of him saying, "Oh, well, I love you," and saying it desperately, like he's almost like saying it triggers her to be like, "Oh, you are so pissing me off right now. Like, I love you and everything, but like you are enraging me by just saying what you think I want to hear."
Maybe
it's like it felt to me like he was making the situation worse, like by saying that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think that her sort of the 4 times thing is a motif that comes back as he's tying her up, and that doesn't work as well for me. I did think that she seems very much like Fatal Attraction in the car, where this whole like your body makes a promise, even if you don't. I mean, that is so close to sort of like I will not be ignored.
Yeah.
It is, it strikes me as so very Fatal Attraction, and almost over the top. So I don't like that, but at the same time, I do like the dynamic of. And we've all known situations like this where, this is a cliche, but where the guy absolutely believes, we're friends with benefits, and, the girl develops feelings and, maybe it doesn't say your body makes a promise, but like uses this as, I think that's changed with the generations. I think that young people today, if anything, I know more 20-year-old men who are like, can we not have a relationship? And the women are like, no, getting the feels is the end. I mean, I do think this has changed, but I do like that dynamic. I think it's interesting, at least.
Well, it fleshes out the whole first part of the film, like that whole first act leading up to the crash. It feels so much more fleshed out, like so much more consequential than it does in the other film. Like everything, and it says later on in the film, like there's a thing around consequences. Like they say like, oh, there are consequences. Yeah, everything that happened had consequences. Like it was you can't just do these things, and it feels more like that. And it also feels a bit more like we'll talk about the Seven Dwarfs and those scenarios. It feels a little bit more as well like that David Ames is on a knife edge. Like he enjoys being there, but like he has this 51% share in the company, and then the rest is shared between these 7 board members, but they're trying to sort of like out him. And there's this whole thing. And again, they are played up a little bit to be caricatures, which is part and parcel of it. But it feels like there's a legit fight there. Like he wants this to be successful. Like he enjoys the company. Like when he walks in, like he knows the people that work for him. He seems to have this thing. Yet it's still a bit of a game for him, and that's something obviously that changes later.
Well, I think that just like the depiction of sort of Americana and sort of where his fantasy got some of these ideas from, that I think improves this dramatically. It's amazing how much a little gesturing toward that corporate empire and flashbacks toward him as a son, seeing the father's face. We don't ever see the father's face in the Spanish one.
Yeah.
Here we know something about their relationship, and we see that board. It's not just a sort of, fantasy in the background that you could, if you want, things. Here, they're much more fleshed out. They're a part of the movie. They're not really ultimately any more important, but you actually have a sense of his childhood. You have a sense of what his job is like. You have a sense that, yeah, whether you want to say knife edge or that his job does involve stress and competition, and it's not Succession, but it's got those kinds of elements to it.
Yeah, and you say about the father, one of the things that's like you say, you don't see the father's face in the original. There's a painting, there's a wall-size mural painting of his father's face in his apartment. Like, he is literally being watched by his father like all the time. And also, like, I love the fact that they make a reference to his father's biography. Like, his father was some magazine mogul, in those sort of early decades. And he there's a single line referencing David. What when David was a child, he was delightful, and that's it. And so there is this sense, again, talking about consequences of like, well, those actions of that father figure have these consequences. They sort of like, they grew and nurtured this person to be this thing. So like, this idea of like, yes, it was David's choice to get in that car. And yes, it was David's choice to treat Giuliani that way. But all that goes back. You can go, okay, well, that comes from the way he was raised, like the childhood he had, and that goes back to this and that. So, like, we are all a succession of stories that inform our lives. And I like that that's dropped in as well. That it's not just he's a dick. It's like, oh no, look, this is the world he's been raised in.
Yeah, these are a number of things that I think are subtle changes that make this a better film for me. That line about consequences, that's implicit in the first one, but it's much more explicit here without, somebody putting a thumb on the scale and saying, aha, here is the moral of the film. It's done subtly, but done well. You were talking about his treatment of Julie. Well, he doesn't know that she isn't okay being fuck buddies, right? So his treatment is different. In the first one, he clearly knows she's crazy, and she's it's the sort of like Back to the Future, what? You chicken moment that she gets him to get into the car, right? What are you scared of? Here, it's a lot easier to understand why he would get into the car with this person who he does not understand is as, not just, crazy, but as seriously into him as he is. And then the stuff with the childhood, with this web of circumstance that we're all in, that little things, this sense of neglect, that he was neglected as a child, that he wasn't really important. Another thing I wanted to mention along that line is, it seems to me that in importing this into America, some of the inspiration for the David Ames character is JFK Jr. And this sort of like, I'm handsome, I've inherited this, if not an empire, but this name. JFK Jr., had a magazine empire with George and whatnot. And it's different, but the sense of like the absent father, this legacy I can't live up to, and that is something that is again part of that Americana, that American story that we can all sort of identify a little with Tom Cruise, even if it's not our experience that we were raised with this level of success and opportunity.
This thing of second generation millionaires or billionaires has come into the fore, hasn't it? Really, like it's probably less of a thing. This was probably a rarity, I would say, but has become more, and I don't like to it doesn't need to come up on everything, but Donald Trump is another one. How often did we read in the papers during his presidency that, like, he acts like this because he was constantly trying to impress his father, and the way to impress him was to be this bully, to be this character. And that's what he has become because of this sort of childhood, this household that he grew up in.
And an absent and distant father. But don't say these things, because I want to like David Ames. I mean, I identify with this movie more than...
but then there's a level of charisma and the fact that, like, he wants to change. Donald Trump's a very different character. And
this character is motivated. He might be motivated by drinks and girls, but he does have some sort of caring about love, right? I mean, and the other thing is, this is the cusp of, you mentioned earlier how it seems so naive today to think that running 3 magazines would be supply well. But this is right at that cusp of the transition into the internet, where the internet is clearly around, and it's mentioned in this film. They talk about, people will read again as this sort of mantra of those magazines. Well, we know that didn't come true, right?
Yes.
People, they read, and what they read is Wikipedia and, clickbait headlines, right? But this was an era where that did seem like it might be possible. There might be some sort of Hail Mary pass. And, and I, again, unlike Trump, right, where real estate and just tearing down buildings and, those deals were not to create, anything beautiful. I mean, there is something noble about this empire that, while subtle, is something we can care about David Ames for.
Yeah, and he is less corrupted by, it's not like they're trying to say this is a corrupt empire. No, it's not burning down forests with that. Like it's related to it, and so that makes him just a much more likable character, which helps. However, let's talk about sort of like Sophia then. Let's talk about Penelope Cruz, like her interplay and her being in this film compared to Open Your Eyes. She's still sort of, clearly very good in this film. I think she has a great presence. I think she has. It's interesting that I said like she's the one that shines in Open Your Eyes. And in this, it's clear that there's a Hollywoodization because like she steps into this, and it's like you were a sort of a big fish in a little pond. This is, I don't be patronizing about European cinema. Like you were clearly like, the big fish in the little pond. You've just stepped into a much bigger pond, and you are now on par rather than exceeding these people on screen. But even to be sort of like at this point to be sort of like, working in comparison to like Cameron Diaz, who was the it girl at the time, and Tom Cruise, that's a fantastic step up for your sort of like, Hollywood debut.
Yeah, and she seems to me to be a little more distant in this. I think she's more effective in the Spanish version. There are more close-ups in the Spanish version where she's being charming, and I think she's stunningly beautiful and she's stunningly charming, and I understand why anyone would fall for her. And this, she seems more like, and this might be, there's always this sort of like, don't upstage Tom Cruise, and in fact, when he and she and Jason Lee are in the streets together, there are a couple of times where I thought, oh, he's not wearing his, his risers, and he's very short. But so there is this sort of clash of potentially ego, potentially attention there. I think she seems a little more distant, and it still is a very good performance, and I still think she's charming, but less so. And she seems more like the quirky Spanish girl rather than this like absolutely engaging woman who you just look into her eyes and think, who the hell am I?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because this goes back again to these rom-com tropes, and this is what has kept coming into my head when they go into her apartment. Like again, this film could have gone in such a different direction from that one night. It feels such a bunch of cliches in certain places, and that's exactly who she is. Like you see this rich, influential magazine owner, and he's got all these like very sort of like manicured people around him at this party. Cameron Diaz is sort of like appearing naked to him in his bedroom and this other things. Like he's got all this stuff, and then she's there, and she is beautiful, and she's very charismatic and all this other stuff, but she doesn't shine in the same way. But she is quirky. Like they give her this thing of like she's got a coat that's too big, because she's the girl with the coat that's too big. And it feels like that sort of like it rang bells with other rom-commy moments where like, oh, she's the, you know, it's the crazy or the quirky one, sort of like the Zoe Deschanel of the whole situation. That's how she has to be identified in this film, to be separate, to be apart. And she's not just an actress, she's an all-round artist. Like, she's come to New York to be a dancer and an actress and an artist and all this other stuff. Like, it's something extra. And so she's a very bohemian, like, to her to be bohemian more in this is sort of like, that's the exotic. It's the exotic, isn't it? The quirky and the exotic. That's the attraction. Unfortunately, it feels very played out watching this in 2021.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, although like the comparison to Zoe Deschanel is apt, when I say she's quirky, I mean Zoe Deschanel. You know, I mean, if she played this part, you would just think, you know, yeah, exactly. Like, what is the attraction here? I get it. Everything would scream quirky alternate chick. You know, I don't feel like that's really, that button isn't being pressed over and over and over here. Yeah, Penelope Cruz's character Sophia is quirky here, but I think the idea is that she's also real. You know, her, you know, in contrast to the privilege of David Ames, her apartment is messy, and you see that she's got to have 2 jobs, and she says, you know, I work round the clock to pay for this apartment. And yeah, she's quirky. She says, you know, I'll see you in the next life when we're cats.
I hate that line, by the way. I like
the line, but it is that kind of like quirky TM copyright, you know?
Yeah. I see what you're saying, because one of the things is when they go to the apartment, and I love the scene when he does go to her apartment, and it's that thing where the quirkiness works for me, because it's done well in both films, but you see the photos of her life. You know, you see this thing of her with other people, or her dancing or acting or performing, or on the beach with her dog, all these different things. And he has a line where he says, I love your life. And she says, oh, it's not for sale. And it's a nice little moment, but it says so much about him and her. And you see this thing about it being real. He's legit. Like, there's a moment of him saying, like, I wish I had your life. Like, your life looked really good. And, you know, she's got, you know, jokes, it's not for sale. Like, you know, it's that quirkiness again, but it's a nice moment. And it's sort of, to me, that's that minor little interaction over the fridge door is the moment where I'm like, that's the click. That's the real click for me between them. And it means a lot. And it feels legit. And that's where I think you're right. He's attracted, not so much she's beautiful and she's charismatic, but it's that thing of her being real. Like, she's got this life, this warmth. And she says, and I think he has like a narration moment, but she actually says about coming to New York, and she says, well, shouldn't you make it if you're a good person with good intentions, willing to work hard? And there's like, then she says, like, you think I'm naive? And he's like, no. And that's the moment he falls in love with her, because, you know, it's clear on the screen. And again, it shows in Cruise's performance, and sort of like that thing of like, I fall in love with her a little bit, because you're like, man, you are just sort of like, you are that character, like, you know, that dream girl, that sort of thing. I can see why he is attracted to you. But there's this other thing of like, you know, however, don't forget, like, she's still crazy, she's still a little quirky. And then when she says that cat's line, that's when I'm like, fuck. That moment, that interaction in the apartment is perfect, absolutely perfect.
Well, I agree with you. If we're going to draw the line between being real versus being quirky, right? I mean, this is a false dichotomy, yada yada yada. But I mean, the realness seems to work for me better, and that is it is more understandable why somebody like David Ames would fall in love with her. And I mean, your example is not just of somebody being real, but somebody being still innocent, you know, and unspoiled by not just New York, but, you know, the high stress corporate world that he comes from. And we do see this all the time, right? That, yes, for as many, you know, old money and rich people get with other rich people, you know, sometimes you see this where, you know, when somebody falls out of that or departs from that stereotype, it's often somebody who, just is not intimidated by them and is not going to be the yes men that they have surrounding them. And it's going to say, yeah, you're a little full of yourself here. And just provide that sort of reality that isn't intimidated by them the way everybody else in his life, even his friendship. I mean, he's bought that friend. But, that friend, there are these lines where that friend says, you owe everybody, you own everybody here. And whether that's an exaggeration or not, I think that level works better than the quirkiness.
Yes.
To that point, I think that as they get together in his fantasy after the splice, there are moments where I think, okay, I mean, she's quirky, she's wonderful, but what is their relationship like? Like when the charm of the quirkiness goes away. And I mean, I think so there's the quirky as like a fetish, right? And then there's the quirky as the charm of somebody saying something surprising, right? Which all of us find charming to one degree or another, especially as we're used to dealing with, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. All the tedium of nonsense that we call conversation. And then somebody says, some crazy shit, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. That I get, but I find it hard to fully imagine their relationship, and that it would carry forward and stay so much in love.
Yeah, but that's not a problem because it's his fantasy.
Yeah.
Which we obviously learn. And I think that's the thing. In the fantasy, you don't have to worry about the mundane. That never happens because you're always in the honeymoon period. That's the fantasy. And that seems to be what he's obviously aiming for, that this idea of this perpetual honeymoon period. And I like, eventually at the end when you hear about, there's a moment again at the end when you see the real world, when you see what really happened, the sort of post, the real version of post splice,
narrated by the LE person. Yeah,
I like all that, and we'll get to that because that sort of gives another one of those moments of like real that I sort of feel sort of like really sort of touched me actually. One of the things, it's sort of like, yes, I'm married and I'm very happily married, but like, that thing of sort of like at your funeral, sort of like, some mysterious woman at the back of the sort of room crying, and it was like, who the fuck is that? That sort of like, that's always a sort of an interesting one. But that's the sort of thing. But anyway, besides that thing of like, why he feels unknown, but why he sort of that next morning when he walks out and he's got the drawing and this sort of like, I can see why he's elated. She's elated. Like it feels much more like this has been a sort of like a sparks, like this is Big Bang stuff. However, in contrast to that, after the accident and sort of like the semi sort of facial reconstruction, and he finally gets the courage up to go see her again and invites her to go for a drink. When in Open Your Eyes, it happens in the park, doesn't it? When it's raining and it feels, as we said, like he is guilting her or sort of like into coming along because he's not a great guy. He feels like a bad guy. Like he is looking for something to cling on to from that former life. With this, it feels sweeter. Like it feels like a legit sweet moment again. So when she asks the best friend to come along, it confuses me because I'm like, that did not play out in that scene. That scene did not feel like her being uncomfortable with this version of David. Like he never comes across as manic or creepy or obsessive. He comes across as relatively, like you say, and maybe this is Cruise not wanting to go there, but that scene never comes across like her saying that I need a chaperone because this could go wrong, like it did in Open Your Eyes.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and it might also be Crow wanting to appeal to a general audience, and Americans don't like unlikable protagonists. I agree with you completely. And I think that scene, one scene that is a lot better in the Spanish version is where he is trying to repeat their sort of narrative,
Yes.
their dialogue at the party where they sort of had their first chemistry, and it comes off as so uncomfortable and creepy in the Spanish version. And here it comes off as like not working for the most part, but still kind of charming. And she participates much more in this version. Like she says certain lines and then stops participating. And she seems much more diffident in this than really creeped out.
Yeah, I think the whole disco scene doesn't work.
Hmm.
I think the whole scene doesn't work. You know, I understand why he chooses his mask, but then his friend is a complete dick to him about it. Like, you know, he's like, take off the mask. He's like, I can't. It's like, you know, like he knows him enough, and he's like, no, I can't. It's an antiseptic thing. At that point, you'd be like, all right, you're clearly uncomfortable. I'll let it slide. And then sort of even Sophia, like after he sort of gets uncomfortable at everything, she's still talking to all these other blokes. Like she's talking to a load of other guys. At one point, he interrupts her, and she's talking to a completely random guy.
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm thinking, not like, oh, you cow, but like, you know, David's there, and he's asked you to there, and he's clearly in a bad space. Like you are just pouring petrol into this situation. Like, you know, this whole situation feels unfocused. This whole scene felt really unfocused again to get to this one point that just doesn't work. And I do think the Open Your Eyes version is much better.
I agree, and I do think that Cesar in the Open Your Eyes version seems much more not just drunk but messed up.
Yeah,
there's much more sort of shots. I mean, he vomits in the bathroom. There are more scenes of him, more shots of him at the bar, seeming messed up. Yeah, it did strike me as strange that that the Penelope Cruz character is not, that she's talking to a new set of people, where it's like, where's the friend? You should be talking to the friend. But I didn't have the same sort of like, you know, you cow, what about him moment. For me, it was more like he's been gone for, like, he just went off. I mean, and I've been, you know, in that situation, and I've gone off. I've been the one who went off, and I've been the one who was like, you know, screw them. You know, they went off. We can't find that person anymore, or we see him at the bar. They're okay.
In that case, then, if that's the thing, like if it is a screw, if that's a well, you went off, like have that confrontation. Have her fight back. Like you literally just walked off and got shit faced at the bar. Like, you left me in this place. Like but she seems so unconfrontational at this point. Like, you know, submissive even, that I'm just like, it doesn't feel awkward. It just feels a bit like, you know, all right, well, I've got to get through this. It doesn't feel like where in Open Your Eyes, there's a reason that this night is the splice. You know, there's a reason you've had this 2 nights. One when he first met Sophia, and then the second time he goes out with Sophia, and they're both transitional in different ways. You know, and I think the first one's meant to be this, like, you know, big bang moment of falling in love, and the second one's meant to be this crashing to earth of how it's all completely tits up. And, you know, I feel that the first one doesn't really work in Open Your Eyes, but the second one works better. And in, obviously, you know, in Vanilla Sky, the first one works better and the second one doesn't work. Have the two.
But you mentioned about the splice. I mean, I agree with you that the scene in the bar works better in the Spanish version. Having said that, I don't know what this implies for choosing this as your splice moment, right? Because either way, it's weird, right? Like, I'm going to begin my memories after my really horrible experience. Right?
No, I get it. I get it completely. Maybe this says something about. No, it completely says something about me. You know my love of, like, you know, plot cliches. Like, I'm all about the, you know. To me, if I was going to splice my memory, if I wanted to have that fantasy, I love a good redemption arc. It's coming back from your lowest point, fighting back. It's Rocky. It's, you know, it's all these things. If that's the fantasy, to be saved by your dream girl, to have the fact that your shittest night is then eradicated by an act of kindness, is important because it allows you to stand up and sort of like, you know, if he hadn't, because you couldn't, I don't think you could splice earlier because it wouldn't make sense because you've had, you know, he's had the accident.
So why choose this moment for the splice, right? I mean, in Vanilla Sky, I would say it makes sense because that's the last time I saw her. And yes, I wasn't the creepy weird. I mean, if I don't want to splice a memory, like I've done dumb things drunk, right? I've said dumb things and said the wrong word, and then everybody's horrified, and I'm like, this was one word, you know, like I don't know how I'm out of line. I don't want to relive that memory. I don't want to like start right. I'm gonna erase that from my memory. I think you know, it's a little weird in the Spanish version to go back to like your worst night where the girl that you love and think it's like your salvation, you've built up into your salvation, which is more clear in that one is not the case. It's him building it up. And when you got beat down and rejected and shown what a creepy, just SOB you are, that's what I want to preserve. I mean, I get what you're saying. Like that's you need that for the redemption arc. I don't want to relive that.
I know. I'll tell you what. The best friend character in this film tells you why. Because you can't have the sweet without the sour.
Yeah,
and that's the point, though. And I think, well, all right, from a filmmaking point of view,
between the two, right? Because we were just saying the Spanish one, he is revealed to be an absolute asshole in that scene. He is the creepy guy you don't want at a bar. Okay, he's just that guy. In the American version, he's not that guy. There's still a little chemistry, and the reason why he's choosing that slice is that's the last time I saw her, and she never. I'm going to be with her in my fantasy, and that's the last time I really had a connection. I really saw the real version of Sophia. Okay, so that makes sense to me, and it's not the last time. And the last time she spat on my face and said, "You're a piece of shit," you know. You know, it's just it was a diffident sort of reaction, and it didn't go great. But okay, I can understand that.
Yeah, okay, I can see what you're saying. It needs to happen for the film to happen is probably the only answer to really get into it. Because if you think about it, like you say, if you really wanted to splice, you'd splice the bit before you got into the bloody car.
Yeah.
You know, you'd splice it and then never think about Julie again and just be like, yeah, no, I got up, I went home, I went to work, and life was wonderful. That would sort of be the moment you splice.
I mean, I would choose the last moment I was alive. I'd be like, oh, I magically got well. I would be like, I want to keep every part of that memory, good and bad. I don't want to erase shit.
No, it's interesting because when you do find out what he has erased, that moment, everything that happened after, there's actually, like, you know, it's not as, again, it's that thing of in the Vanilla Sky version, like he wakes up the next morning and he wakes up almost angry. Like they make out that like he's determined. Like he brings on the lawyer, he takes on the 7 dwarfs, those board members, fights them back, retains sort of like complete control of the company, and then they're like, and then he withdrew. It's almost like he got his victory and was like, now what? I've done it, and I'm not sure what to do with myself, and there's no one to share it with. And it's sort of like Sophia was always this thing that hung over him in the background, and he was trying to distract himself with all this, with work, you know, the sort of getting up to date and educating himself, and the confrontation with everything. And then when it's over, it's still there. And I kind of like that moment that it's sort of like, yeah, you withdrew again because there was nothing else, and that's when he found Life Extension on the internet.
Well, I like that sort of narrative because it is not just good or bad, right?
No.
You know, he's got the determination to fight back, but you know, it also is true that the narrator, the tech support guy, says the headaches were still a problem. You know, I mean, he is still messed up, and I think this happens in life where it's like, okay, hey, good job, buddy. You did, you know, good job, buddy. You know, you did great, but you know, yeah, there was that illness, or there were
Mm.
these things that you couldn't control. The thing about withdrawing is, I mean, one of the many ways in which I find this film just incredibly painful, and I think more painful in your description of it than mine. That sort of he withdrew, and it's like, right, well, I've got this empire, got my PhD, and I'm still alone and still sad every day, and
And in
I'm going to
pain.
take these pills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I find, like, that moment of, like, when he reaches that moment and they show him sort of sat in his apartment, and it's massive. Like, his apartment is, like, fucking stunning. Like, it's amazing. And it's just this used to have been hollow, and I feel there is a hollowness to parts of this film, and I do feel for that. Like, again, like, it's weird to say, as I say, this is the weirdness of this is to say, like, I love my family, and I've got, I wouldn't say a good job, I've got a job, and I've got all these great things that I do, like the podcast, and I've got these other great things, but I can still empathize. There've been times in my life where I have sort of like plowed into things because of some hurt or something. You think it'll go away, or grief, and then you come out of the bit you would sort of throw yourself into, and you're like, oh no, shit, I still feel crap. Like, I've actually got to face this as well. Like, it's not just going to go away, and that's really hard. And I feel for him. And he finds an alternative, and again, instead of facing up to this loss and what he's done in this emotional sort of like baggage, he finds another way to get away from it. And,
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, we both identify. It's that sort of like, well, wherever you are, there you are. Wherever you go, there you are.
Shit, you're quoting Buckaroo Banzai.
I know. Which I don't find a deep line, but it applies in this case.
Yeah.
It can be. I don't think it's deep in that film, but no, it's the you can't escape yourself. And no matter what accomplishments you have, there's still the dark night of the soul where you're sitting there alone, going like, but what do I have really? But what it's the Alfie moment, right? But what do I really have?
Yeah, I think there are many people that can attest to those moments. You sat at 4 o'clock in the morning, whether it be you haven't slept or you've woken up and you're feeling anxious or stressed, or you've got some concerns or grief, and there is that moment you're sat in the dark and you're like, what is the fucking point? Like, what have I got? And it can take a lot, even for you to go, yeah, actually, I have got something. I've got this, I've got that, and it can be really hard. And for different people, I'm assuming, it can be worse for people with different, with depression or anxiety and all this. Like, it can be really difficult, and this film really taps into that of like, yeah, being alone. Like, it's, it's interesting. The thing I would say in this film as well is the Open Your Eyes doesn't do as well. It gives us Timothy Spall in his sort of like friend lawyer.
Yeah,
that acts in another part that's, again, like almost like his conscience in a weird way of like trying to pull him back up and trying to sort of give him these things.
It sort of connects you to the corporate world, but also gives him another sort of surrogate to talk to, another friend character.
Yeah, it's and you realize that he was there, and he, if you notice though, the Timothy Spall character, what's interesting, he's there at the start of the film, and he's not really there in the fantasy.
Yes,
like he's not.
That's true.
He's not
really important to
no.
The Tom Cruise character. And
it's not until they get that you go through the reality again and they show you what actually happened, and they narrate through what happened, that he becomes incredibly important to those last sort of months of his life. And so again, like by splicing there, like he cut out all this other stuff. It's really interesting to sort of see how that person sort of like, how people become either very important or less important depending on what part of your life you sort of lean into.
Well, I wanted to say something about what you were saying about sort of the dark night of the soul. That, one of the things that had changed in watching the Spanish version in the past versus now is I have less compassion for that rich fuck, right?
Yes.
You know, I mean, we now, you know, we live in a different society in which we're
Mhm.
much more conscious of these things, and you and I have gotten older. That affects it too, but we're also more conscious of these things socially. I think the depiction of Tom Cruise's loneliness and suffering, I think we're supposed to feel in both films that his desire for Penelope Cruz, his desire for love, is something we can identify with, and his despair about his disfigurement. But whereas I feel the Spanish one really suffers with time, this movie is of its time, but it has not aged poorly. If anything, I think it's aged very well for me. And I think that what you're suggesting of sort of the universality of a man sort of despairing and saying, "What have I got?" And wanting something more is one of the ways that we can identify with somebody, even if they're of a different socioeconomic background and, inherited money and all this stuff.
Yeah, I want to sort of tap into something that's, and this is good because this podcast is going somewhere. I didn't know it was going to go this way, but we never do. There's been a recognition of late, and I'm seeing it more on things, which I think is fantastic. It was recently International Men's Day, I believe, and one of the things that's highlighted at the moment, and I see it is, and it's heartbreaking, but it's true. Is I and this is not. I'm trying to think how to talk about this. I understand that women have issues, and we try to understand them, and there's other things. But men have issues, and there's one issue that I think is massively underplayed, and I'm glad it's been recognised. Is the suicide rate for men is massively higher than it is for women.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the key factors in that is the social acceptance of talking about your feelings and about where you're at, or reaching out to a friend. Like, women have got fantastic social networks for the most part. That's a generalization I'm making, because just through my own experience of women have this ability, and I'm envious of it, to have a friend who they can call up and be like, I feel like crap. I'm feeling really down. I want to talk about it, or whatever, and they'll have a conversation.
You can do that to me, man. I'm here.
We are lucky. We are lucky in the grand scheme of things. But I know there are macho guys that I know fucking suffer. And the moment are you all right? Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, it is. You know how it goes. And you're like, all right. They can't go there. And that's what watching is tapped into that for me of yeah, no, you say about the universality of this. Yeah, I can imagine there being these moments of guys going yeah, no, life is hard. I've lost the woman I love. It's the one I got away. I don't know how to process this. I'm really not sure who I can talk to. And then if you do try and talk to someone, it's going to become banter or jokes. There's no sort of seriousness to it. And so it felt really important that this whole situation could have been resolved. Yes, I get that the Jason Lee character sort of says to him, see a therapist. But even that, it should be tell me. He's he's trying to send him to a therapist, which is great. But he's also should be saying tell me, what do you want to talk about?
Yeah, be real with me. I mean, if you're attracted to Penelope Cruz because she's real, fucking get real, man.
Yeah. And so I do feel it's tragic when you do see that, and I don't want to have this, the cliche of it's lonely at the top, but loneliness sort of there's some of this film seeps with loneliness. Absolutely, sort of you feel it. And I find that fascinating, and that's why I do think this film resonates 20 years later.
I go to a recovery group, and I have had close relationships with Ben, honest relationships. I tend to be very wear my feelings on my sleeve and not be a very private person. One of the things that I have learned, having in-depth emotional conversations with guys of all ages, from their 20s to their 90s, is this emotional repression to the extent that so many men, especially my generation and older, don't even know what they feel because they've never asked those fucking questions.
Mm.
And then I think, of course, I feel sorry for their wives. I mean, how the hell do you married to somebody who doesn't even know what he feels and is acting out, and it's crystal clear to you that there's an issue and they're not even conscious of. But I mean, men, we do have to have a culture in which men can talk about these things. What you said about loneliness, I stopped this movie halfway through, you know, and talked to a friend because I was so upset. And I made a list of just like the stuff that gets me, that I, you know, like, looking back on being popular, the life of the party, and being old or whatever. You know, people making me the center of conversation, you know, of their focus when I didn't ask for it. Like, you know, the depression, the disappointment at how a promising life turned out, lingering suspicion that none of this is real, you know, madness, sort of mental illness, abusive relationships. You know, we joked before about like, you know, the crazy girl. You know, I mean, it wasn't until recently that I realized, like, wait a minute, most of the women half the women I've dated have tried to stab me at some point. You know, it's probably not good. I have face blindness, so, you know, the idea of confusing these two women or whatever. I've had facial disfigurement from an accident. I have fear of heights that makes me nauseous, and thoughts of suicide. So and I'm a fucking lonely ass motherfucker. So there are so many things here that just resonate with me emotionally and that I identify with. And you know, for me, that's ultimately why I find this movie so affecting and so powerful going back to it.
No, I agree. And all of that sort of like, you know, rings true. To like, you know, where like Open Your Eyes suffered is because, like, say, you find the character sort of like, you know, not so much unlikable, but like it was difficult to sympathize, empathize, like, because he was such a dick at times. Like, you know, you follow the story, it's fine, but with this film, yeah, like Cruise is human. Like they're looking to make him a human character. And I think, you know, that goes to his performance, but also the direction of Cameron Crowe. But there are moments, like you say, you know, that just when he is disfigured, and again, the disfigurement used, the you know, the prosthesis they use in this is not as extensive as it is in the, you know, it's something that has to be identified. Like, you know, half of his face is like, you can't get rid of all that Cruiseness. We can't lose it all.
We're paying him how many millions of dollars? God damn it, we're gonna see his face.
Yeah, exactly. This is the superhero movie cliche, isn't it? Of like, you know, why they wear masks for like 30 seconds. But yeah, there is this thing. There are moments in from after disfigurement where they do linger on this fact that, whether it be through his own actions or people's reaction to his disfigurement, like, he is isolated, and they depict it well. But, you know, this idea of sort of like this flat, this apartment he's got, this filled with people at this party. But how real is it? Like, you know, like you say, this thing about getting real, being real, authentic, sincere. How real is that party? Like, how many of them are there because they're a bit like, well, the boss has called a party, so we better go, or whatever. To who is there for him in those moments? And I do feel it. And, you know, there are times that I get imposter syndrome. You know, I get anxiety. I get, you know, times, but I also suffer from imposter syndrome. That idea of like, I look around frequently in my own work and at other things, like at the podcasters, and I've done things, and I'm like, how the hell am I doing? Why am I doing this? Like, you know, like there are people like much more qualified to be doing this, or clearly better at doing this. Like, how have I ended up here? And you do get that isolation when you're just like, yeah, no, this is all, like you say, this is a fraud. Like, I'm a fraud. I'm scared of being found out. Like, someone's going to find out that I shouldn't be doing this and tell me I shouldn't. And so you create almost like an isolation in some experiences where I'm like, this will protect me because then there's no bugger there to tell me I shouldn't be doing this thing. And I feel that with this film, that he creates this sort of, even the choice to do the lucid dream is creating a false reality to protect himself, to live the life he wants to lead. So he can't have others tell him he can't. Because when you watch the reality, that's exactly what happens. He has to fight for things. And he's like, it's hard and it hurts. And so like this whole sort of second half is way more affecting in this film than it is in the other film. Not as dark, but definitely more affecting.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm a big fan of transgressive cinema, and it's sometimes this isn't trying to transgressive cinema piece, but the thing that tends to define transgression as a genre is an acute awareness of the distance between people. And when you were talking about, you know, imposter syndrome and Cruz at that party, the phrase that occurred to me is sort of alone in a crowded room. And, you know, my version of that is much more less, you know, imposter syndrome and more like they don't really care about me. You know, it's all a fraud on their parts rather than on my part. And, you know, they like that I'm charming. They like that, you know, I can do this or that, but they don't, you know, really care about me. And at the end of the day, I'm still fucking alone. And all of us feel that for one reason or another. The difficulty and is this distance between us, between everyone, that we don't know each other's thoughts, we don't know each other's feelings, and we struggle to share our own, even if we do know them. And this ties in very closely, it seems to me, with this theme of love. And whereas, again, in the Spanish version, it seems like he's just a dick who wants to get with, you know, these girls, which fair enough. Here, it seems to resonate with the idea of that we have culturally, and that I think is hard to escape, of love as like, that's going to fix me. Like, I'm alone at a party. I inherited this. I don't love my job. I'm in a room with people who smile to my face and think I'm wonderful and call me Citizen Dildo behind my back, right? Or, you know, we can all identify with that, not necessarily Citizen Dildo, but our suspicions that either we're a fraud or their feelings are fraudulent or whatever. And we think love will fix this. And maybe, you know, Penelope Cruz, you know, like Penelope Cruz and that lawyer friend of his should get together and just say like, okay, here's what you need to do, David. And they could put together a plan. But the reality is that usually if we're not secure enough in ourselves and we're not really where we need to be, jumping into that relationship with that quirky girl who seems so real isn't going to solve your problems. And yet it's such a tempting thing, right?
Well, yeah,
to
two
feel
things.
Whole, because then we'd fucking feel whole when we're alone at night.
Two things. First thing, as nicknames go, Citizen Dildo's not the worst. I think I could probably manage to wear that as a badge of honor. That's a different take on it. You say about this cultural thing about love, and I've seen this held up as a criticism of Disney films in particular, but rom-coms are just as guilty of it. This idea that it ends with "and they lived happily ever after." You know, Sleeping Beauty is woken up by her Prince Charming, and they lived happily ever after. Snow White is saved from the poison by the kiss, and they lived happily ever after. Ariel finds her voice, and her and Eric live happily ever after. Blah 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 blah. And it goes on and on and on. Cinderella, you know, she puts on the slipper, and that's it. Cinderella's probably a closer example of this that one night,
Mm.
and it ends in it results in the search. Maybe Eric, maybe the prince didn't find her and he actually went into a fantasy room. I don't know. But this idea of even rom-coms, everything from, While You Were Asleep, I can't think of fucking hell, typical ones, like the 4 Weddings and a Funeral, or I can't think of any right now. While You Were Sleeping, I don't really watch rom-coms, so I'm not sort of sure. But there's an absolute girth and dearth of them out there. They all have that same premise, don't they? That, two star-crossed lovers, will meet, and that relationship will have sparks and there'll be troubles, but it will always end with, and they lived happily ever after. And this film gets to that point where this is what I'm saying. That's why I say this film starts like a rom-com. Like, it could easily go off in a different direction, and it could end with, and they live happily ever after. And that's what David wants, because he wants the sort of like the act, the structure is that moment, that disco moment is the sort of like, well, I've blown it all, and it should end up with him running through an airport to find her and do you know what I mean, to win her back,
or holding the boombox,
Yeah, exactly. Which was a Cameron Crowe, say anything. That's exactly right. Or to be stood in the rain and say, like, I'm just a boy talking to a girl. Whatever it is, that's the sort of like, it's almost like you say about David Ames being infused with pop culture and its sort of structure. Even that choice of being sort of coming up from that bottom moment to have the story to be saved and is so built into our own expectations of personal narrative that it completely makes sense to me as to why he chose that moment and to why his fantasy then rolls out into this thing. Because he is living, for all intents and purposes, the structure of a rom-com. Like, this film could be that. Or a fairy tale. Like, they joke about that as well. The fact there's not fairy tale motifs within this is actually quite surprising. But I don't know, that's what sort of strikes me.
Well, I think what's dangerous is the idea that a relationship is going to fix or save us, right? And he suffers from that, right?
Yeah.
Now, relationships should make us better.
Yes.
But they make us better because we're honest and we're able to call each other on stuff. I don't mean you and me romantically, but I mean all kinds of relationships make us better, hopefully, because we're, able to do things together. Romantic relationships hopefully do make people better. But when they do, it's because people are honest and able to encourage each other in healthful and good directions. That's an entirely different thing from, like, I'm fucked up and this is the answer, right?
Yes.
Here's the panacea, right? I feel alone at parties. This board is on my back. I feel my best friend and I don't even have a close relationship. I mean, He's only my friend because I'm paying for his novel. And I have meaningless sex with people, but this girl is going to fix me. And I think he thinks that. So that's the Disney, that's the criticism, right? It's not that, I mean, you're right. We all have these narratives, right? But this idea, I think, is a dangerous idea.
Oh, it is, and it's one of those things, I think, as being, you said being transgressive, I think, or being eroded. I think those notions in cinema are being eroded. Like, those films are still there. Those early Disney films, or those early 90s rom-coms in particular, I don't think they'll have aged well in those respects. And I think when people go back and watch them now, I do think people will be like, hang on, that doesn't quite doesn't add up like it used to. Which is good. I think people are recognizing that, and I think that's one of the reasons, you say about relationships, that relationships from, and again, like you say, me and you, we're two sort of like, white guys in our 40s. It's sort of like, I'm not totally in touch with the sort of like the dating scene for those in his 20s, but from an outside perspective looking in, I definitely see that there is more authenticity out there of people actually saying, do you know what, I'm okay to have friendships. I don't need a romantic, I don't need a partner, I don't need a man, I don't need a woman in my life to define me. I can be who I am and have friendships, and those are healthy. And I think that's great, you know, because when I was younger, that was the thing. You hit sort of 20, you know, you hit sort of 21, all of a sudden it was like, right, you know, like you've had your teen years of sort of like trying. Now it's serious. Like you're supposed to be dating and doing this and doing that. And that was, you know, that was almost like the expectation, like parents sort of saying sort of like, you know, along with get out of our house, like, you know, grow up and get out was this thing of like, you know.
So you really felt that at like 21, like get married and have a house, like?
Yeah, no, honestly, like I had a weird thing when I was a kid. I had many weird things when I was a kid, but this is just one of them. But no, in my head, when and again, I think this was drilled into me for a period. It was like you went to school, and you know, in England, you sort of like you work up to your GCSEs, which is when you're 16, get good grades. Beyond that, you get your A levels, because then your A levels get good grades, because that gets you into university. Go to university, get good grades. You know, it was like because university then leads you into a job. There was no sort of like connective tissue between these things in my head of like, I need these GCSEs to do these A levels to do this degree to do this job. Like I didn't have a linear trajectory towards a specific job. It was just I've got to hit these milestones to get to this end goal. That's probably why I became a project manager, because I had like I didn't really care about the rest. I was just hit the dates. But I went through it, and that's what's happened. It was like, okay, I've done well in these. And I get through university, and then get out of university, and it was like, right, so that's the settling down shit to do now. You know, like I've got to get a job, and I've got to, you know, I'm supposed to be meeting people and going on dates, and like, at what point do I sort of? And then my closest friend at the time, Gaz, he got married when he was 20. Well, he had a kid in his early 20s, 22, 23. And so that's what people would do. But there were people around me getting married. And I'm like, hang on. I'm still at home playing computer games and I'm working in a call center. This ain't right. Like I was the slacker. And so it was, yeah, it was a wall for me. I hit a wall where I was like, I don't know what this road's not clear anymore. Like, where's this next milestone that's the world is setting out for me? And it wasn't really until I started doing the wrestling. This is a complete side note, it's a bit of transgression, but it wasn't until I sort of started doing the wrestling when I came out of university, and I met other people like in their like 20s and 30s and older that were like, yeah, we're all weird. Like, you know, we wear lycra and hurt each other for fun, and some of us are married and some of us are not, and some of us are doing this and some of us are, you know, in these relationships or like, you know, whatever. And you're like, right, so there isn't one single road. Like there's lots of roads. It's like a spaghetti junction of shit going on. And it wasn't, yeah, it took me a while in my 20s to be like, oh, okay, like this isn't a straight road. And I don't know who the hell I am, because I've not decided on this. Like I was supposed to grow up. I kept being told, like, you know, almost to the cliche of like, you know, now you're a man, childish things get put away, you know, don't play with those. And there was a period when I really struggled with that in my early 20s, when I was like, okay, right, well, all comics and yeah, that sort of thing goes, yeah, toys goes away. That's gone. I'm grown up now. Maybe I'll keep on with the computer games a little bit just to sort of, because I've got something else to do. But yeah, it wasn't until a lot later I was just like, well, not like a few years later, I was like, hang on, who am I doing this for?
Yeah, like, you sound very much like the sort of like Fight Club thing, right? Of like, dad said, do this, right? Go to school. Well, what now? Get married. Well, you know, and then it's kind of like, well, what's it all about? You know, but I've done the schema, and there are still people who do this, right? I mean, I do want to point out, We Wear Lycra and Hurt Each Other for Fun is one of the best titles I've ever heard.
Yeah, it might be the title of my biography. What Lycra and Hurt People for Fun? The Scott Weatherly story.
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting because I came up in a sort of like, you know, academic environment and sort of like post-divorce culture in which my version of this was just like, look, work really hard. I thought I was going to be a successful, famous writer. I was the golden boy, and I decided very early on I was not going to compromise. So for me, it was like, I am not getting married unless it's the one, right? And nobody is the one, right? I mean, people are fine, but I was always like, I'm not going to compromise. I'm a perfectionist. And so I just went to college endlessly and was like, okay, so how do I get from here to a job? Or, where are these publishers going to find me? How does, I've written 200,000 pages by this point. How do I make the connection from A to B? Nobody ever told me that. And it was just like, that was just going to happen. You'd meet somebody at college, you'd both a, romantic partner or, a contact. And I had lots of romantic partners. I had lots of people who had contacts. Nobody ever came through. Nothing ever happened. And, I wound up just kind of going like, okay, I'm in this giant pit between point A and B, and I'm still in there. That's what my life turned out to be. Which was very depressing to put it that way. But I've made a life of it. But it's interesting, both of us sort of in different way. Like, you had more of the traditional narrative. I had more of the sort of, post-divorce, so stick to your guns, version of it. But it ultimately failed both of us.
Yeah, well, I think this is more common than not. And I think there's, and I don't know, I couldn't speak for the current generation, but I know of our generation, sort of like early millennials, that sort of like, late 70s, early 80s, that definitely went through it. I have had friends and I've had colleagues that I know at least 3 people that are under 40 and have been divorced, within 10 years of marriage. Mm-hmm. And it was like, well, we got married because we were, it was almost like they just sort of like they fell into it almost, mm-hmm. sort of like, and then after 10 years, they're like, yeah, I don't like you.
I've never understood this. I know this happens, but coming from where I come from, I look at half the couples I see and I think, how the fuck did you think you were going to get married? Like, what was the connection? Well, they were just there. We wanted to, it's like,
it's an
we were just there.
Yeah.
Like,
I honestly think
they're going to be perfect. Yeah. I'm happy every day for 2 years before I even think about a wedding.
That's it. Checklist 1, right? You're doing well so far. 1. There you go. What's number 1? You turned up, right? Well, we can deal with that.
Right.
No, I honestly think there was an expectation. Like, you came out of university or college or whatever, and you hit an age, and this may be a British thing. I don't know. This was in the 90s, like early 2000s, around this time. Like, I turned 18 in 99. Like, this was it. This was sort of that expectation. Like, you hit 21, and there was a big party at 21. Like, you've turned 21. Woo! I could already vote for 2 years. I can vote at 8. I could drink at 18. I've never understood, like, in America, like, you guys have got, the drinking age is 21. Barely obviously recognized, but still. But in this country, like, there's no legislative, legal thing that prevents you from doing anything under the, over the age of 18. Like, it's 18 is the age. You can't. I think 25. You can't rent a car over a certain size until you're over 25, or obviously you've got to have a license. But nothing happens at 21. Yet 21 still seems to be like a milestone birthday, and it's this thing of like, you've finally reached proper adulthood. Fuck off into the world and do your family. That's the sort of the thing. And I did feel those pressures. And I'm turning 40 in a couple of weeks, and I do think, there was time wasted when I was like, I could have so been like writing or doing like learning journalism or doing something like learning to use filming equipment or reading more or just doing something instead of dithering. And
well, you say dithering, but I mean, the grass is always greener, right?
Yes.
I took the opposite path. And I mean, I'm borderline. I mean, I'm totally capable of compromise, but I mean, I'm not very good at settling. You know, and this has been certainly a problem in relationships. I think about past relationships all the time. They haunt me, but I know that it's the good things that haunt me. It's not, those were also relationships where I had friends begging me to break up with them because I did nothing but complain about how miserable I was, and all I remember now are the good things.
Yeah.
What's wrong with me? But I mean, I went through those same years deciding, screw it, I'm gonna write. I'm gonna, get these useless degrees. I went the opposite way, and now I see people who are happily married and they've got 2 kids, and I think, what have I got? I'm Alfie. So I mean, the Tom Cruise character, he longs for the realism, the being real of being poor in New York. Like if you're poor in New York, you're like, I want to be this rich mogul guy.
Yeah, you make a very, very good point. I mean, that the grass is always greener. Like, I wouldn't give up what I have now, for anything. But I do look back at my 20s and think, like, missed opportunities. I often think about my degree as well. Like, I did history. It was great. Could have been focused on something I actually wanted to do, rather, but like that's no point. To pull this right back to the film, though, because I think this has been a fantastic sort of like diversion. And we are sort of coming up on time. There is one final part of this film I want to sort of ask about, or the comparison between this and Open Your Eyes. And that's the mystery element. In Open Your Eyes, it's sort of like it's very early on. You meet César in his mask in a prison cell, and it's very dark and it's very noir, and it's sort of like it's a big part of like what is going on. And you meet the psychologist very early, and sort of it's a much lesser part of Vanilla Sky. And it's almost not so much an afterthought, but it's clearly not a bigger part of what Cameron Crowe is trying to present. And it's almost like, okay, well, I need that to get to the end result, but like I'm less interested in it than the other stuff. That's a fair assessment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I think that watching Open Your Eyes, I sort of feel like there are a bunch of balls in the air. There's a bunch of mysteries, and we don't know how they're what's going on, who has he killed, et cetera, et cetera. That stuff's there in this, but it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like a mystery. It feels, the real mystery is sort of like what's going on, and this grounds it. And I think the end result of that is to ground it in character and ground it in that love story and ground it in these emotions.
No, I agree. And so I think they have different aims. I think the Open Your Eyes is definitely trying to be a mystery thriller. Like it's trying to throw you that I say throw the ball up in the air of the mystery. And I say like, the mystery is almost like it's just needed to get to the end result. Like it's literally there was a plot device, and it feels less like a rolling thread. Which is an interesting choice, but it doesn't seem to. It doesn't detract from it. I thought it would, and as I watched it, I was like, "Is this missing this mystery element? Does it need to be there?" And I'm like, "It's sort of there, but it doesn't need to be as dark or as maybe I thought it needed to be."
Well, Who Have You Killed is a great, thing to go for as a writer. I mean, as a drama. How do you not go there? And yet I think it's part of the genius of this film that it subverts that, it tamps that down. Having said that, what's weird is the murder scene is, I think, much more effective here. You have this whole thing with the mole, and I think it's a little hoaxy. It's a little played up in the earlier dialogue as Tom Cruise says, I could live as that mole. Forget cats. I could come back as your mole, the mole on your breast, right? And then at the end, as he's snuffed her with a pillow, in the original, you don't know who he's killed.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously he's killed Sophia, and they're changing bodies, but it's Sophia, and he's killed Sophia, so it doesn't really matter. In this one, you never see the face in either of them, but in this one you do see the mole, and so the
Yes.
mole is used as a kind of, I think, very effective shorthand to indicate what he's really done here. And I think that scene works fantastically. Again, the music is great. The tension is there. So it doesn't have the mystery element, but it emotionally does have more success for me.
Well, like you said, yeah, the mystery element with the prison cell is less effective and less sort of important. But yeah, the one of the things I come back to is this idea of manic. There's moments of like mania in this film, and I think sort of like, you know, David or Tom Cruise has it. Sometimes it's gurning. I agree. You know, when he lets loose on the doctors and he's like, go and invent something, and he sort of like, they give him the mask and he has that sort of like, he throws his arms around and stuff. Like it's manic, but it doesn't feel authentic. It feels like a sort of a choice that he's made, and you go, all right. With this scene where he's sort of like, he's obviously having sex with her and he's about to go, and he's shouting like, what is going on? Like, what is happening? And he's still having sex with her and stuff. And then he starts to pull the pillow over and stuff. Like, that feels like akin to another film that came out around this time. Again, I think I mentioned it, is American Psycho. This idea of like untrustworthy narrator, and this idea of like this idea of delusions and not going on with perceptions of reality. Like, he knows that something is wrong, and like it's almost like he can't stop himself from committing this act. Like, it's the only thing he knows he can do is to sort of bring it to a close. Yet he's still having sex with her while he does it, and it's manic and like crazy. It's really sort of like affected, and again played well again, because yes, you've got Cameron Diaz who's back as the Julie sort of possessing, or you know, what he sees as thingy, and she is pissing over him a little bit in the sense of like she keeps poking fun at him
and laughing
she's and taunting. Yeah, and
yeah,
so,
I don't know that she's taunting him as much as she's laughing. It feels that to him, right? You know, she's not really they were laughing, right? I mean, it's just taunting him.
At that moment, the moment before, one of the things she says, she quotes his dad's biography back to him about David was delightful when he was a child. Like, it makes me feel like, obviously, this is his brain rebelling in his guilt for sort of Julie coming back to him. And so it feels like his again, we mentioned it last week, that sort of idea of, you know, confidence and paranoia. This is that idea coming through again and sort of taunting him and going like, oh, you think this was all perfect, and here I come to screw it all up. And in this case, in the shape of Julia, and with taunts about how you were sort of neglected as a child and these things. Yeah, it's really sort of creepy and well done.
I agree completely, and it is. You've talked about how this isn't as creepy as the Spanish version, and that's true. But this scene is much creepier.
Yeah.
And the other thing is using the audio, using the other visuals. I mean, film is an audio-visual medium, and I love a good, beautiful long shot as much as anyone. But I love when it's used as an audio-visual medium with collage to get to this kind of place, and it's incredibly effective. It builds to that murder, and again, I identify with this. You know, I not so much, you know, killing your lover while you're having sex with her, but I mean, with the idea of sort of like, you know, this frustration, this madness, and this idea of sort of, I mean, it's there in. You wind up in what really happened, right? That he couldn't escape the headaches, that we're all trapped in this biological body. I've had multiple concussions. I've banged my head multiple times and had my perceptions of reality screwed up. We are, all of us, one brain event away from not knowing who somebody is, you know?
Yeah.
And that's horrifying. And all of us have had experiences of dreams we couldn't get out of and things like this. And I think all of us can recognize, not just from that, but also this sort of existential possibility that of sort of I don't know who this person is. That's horrifying in that scene.
Yeah, and we went through some of these examples when we talked about Open Your Eyes, but it feels more like it, more so, let's say, in Vanilla Sky. And so, like I say, although there's, let's go back to, although there's not the great mystery, like the payoff to the mystery is actually better, which is, bizarre, but it works. Before we wrap up, there is one final thing we talked about quite a lot in the last episode, and I wanted to again draw a comparison. Is the final scene. So we find, he goes to LE. Again, that mystery sort of like the payoff to that is to the LE is lesser, but we find it's life extension. He goes, he has a conversation with Tilda Swinton, which is bizarre because I think it's sort of, again, I'm used to her playing much more interesting roles than just sort of like doctor in office. Yeah. And then he has this conversation about the whole thing. He sees this tech support comes and talks to him and teaches him through. You get the flashbacks of what really happened about him fighting the board, but more importantly, they go to the roof and he has this thing about he has to make the choice. And eventually, like again, they have this whole Matrix moment where, because you've got the bar scene again where he says they're all here for you, they can stop, blah 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 blah. But let's talk about the Doctor. You're not a fan of Kurt Russell. We've sort of talked about this. But,
yeah, he is by far the weakest actor in this.
Yeah, he's not great in it. I will admit that. But more importantly, in the Open Your Eyes, we were saying about how it's a mental breakdown. Like the guy sort of like, the guy who's playing the psychologist sort of falls to his knees and he's like, I'm real. This is played different. What were your thoughts on the way that they sort of play out for the Doctor in this?
Well, I missed that breakdown from Open Your Eyes, whether it was shot or not. On the other hand, that's one of the things that I do find missing from this. On the other hand, all through this part of the narrative that you've described, there are touch after touch after touch of things that are better. One of our complaints about Open Your Eyes is sort of, why does he have to kill himself? Well, throw himself off. Well, he's scared of heights, and he chose this. There's one line, I chose this, didn't I? Right? I like that Ellie is now named something else because it's been 150 years later.
Yes.
There are some, even the sort of like lucid dream fantasy thing, which in Open Your Eyes, I feel like, oh, how does this have to do with, cryogenics again? Here it's presented in a way where the same logical flaw is there, but he finds it in the brochure. And so it doesn't feel like as much of a problem. It's sort of organically presented. Yeah. And you actually get the demonstration with the desk and all of that. So, and even with the psychiatrist, I like, what we don't get is the breakdown, but what we do get is, another thing that's good here is that he's called tech support. Who can forget Tom Cruise with this brilliant music playing, running through an empty building, yelling, tech support. I mean, it's a wonderful moment. But tech support says, what are the names of your kids? And that is a great moment that we get that I'm not sure it compensates for the, what we don't get from Open Your Eyes. But it's good.
It is good. It helps. It's good because I say that to the Kurt Russell, the psychology character, like he says, like he appears, doesn't he? He says, "Oh, I can just think of a character and he'll just appear." Then he comes rushing out the door and says, "Oh, we've got to go. We can't trust these people." And he almost sort of like represents the part of the brain that wants to keep him in the fantasy. Like he's now being presented with a choice, and he sort of presents the part of him, the subconscious, that's going, "No, stay here. Like you can have this fantasy." And I do like that moment where he's like, "No, I'm real." And he sort of says, like, "Well, I'm real." Like he's really trying to sort of like, we've talked about it in this discussion, and it's in this film, this idea of real, what it is to be authentic. And he says, "Well, I've got 2 daughters." And he goes back and he says, like, he talks about going to plays and seeing games and all this other stuff. And then it's all ripped from under him when the tech supporter says, "What are their names?" And he says, and he can't answer. And he doesn't fall to his knees and cry, but there's that sort of moment of like just confusion where he's like, I don't know. And one of the things we sort of complained about for Open Your Eyes was his dismissiveness of that character. Like he's been with him and he sort of like completely ignores him. In this, Tom Cruise sort of like is watching him and he's sort of, before he makes a decision, he's sort of looking at him, and he's looking at him process this information, and it feels more like he's not looking for him to support his decision, but he's like, yeah, no, this is, I don't know how to process this, seeing somebody being sort of like torn asunder in this way. And then it sort of clearly works because the character says goodbye. You know, he says, oh, you've made, he almost accepts it. He's almost like, well, you've made your decision. You've clearly made your decision. Goodbye. And I kind of like that it gives that character closure as well, rather than just to be sat there weeping on the roof.
Yeah, on the other hand, he doesn't really have closure with his friend who shows up on the roof, but they make a bigger deal out of in Open Your Eyes, where there is this kind of goodbye to her. I mean, to the friend. Here, there's no real dialogue of any meaning with the friend, and it cuts to, you know, who I want to see is Penelope Cruz, right, Sophia?
Yeah, and it plays out very similar then, sort of like, you know, saying goodbye, and he gets that choice. So,
but the interesting thing about the doctor is, like, in Open Your Eyes, there's no contest as to what he's going to do, right? It's a fait accompli. The real world is out there. I'm stuck in a nightmare. Of course, I'm going to escape this. It feels oddly more like a choice here. It feels you know, like the doctor may say goodbye as if it's a fait accompli, as if Tom Cruise's brain, you know, has already made its decision. But the tech support does say your finances won't go long in this world.
I love that.
Yes. Like, this is not going to be a utopia for you. You will be in Penelope Cruz's position as a person struggling in New York.
Yeah.
And so it is a real choice whether to, because you can go right back to the fantasy. You can have the girl again. You know, it feels more like a real choice. Here.
Well, it's presented as that. Could they even say as they're going up, they were like, oh yeah, there was an anomaly, we fixed that, you can go straight back. And he says, like, you know, we can eradicate all this, you won't remember any of this, we'll go straight back to your point of choice and you will carry on. Like, there is nothing to worry about. We have, tech support has fixed it, you know, we switched it off and turned it back on again, it's all good. And like this idea when tech support says to him, just, it's all like open and honest, he's like, you know, it's a different world out there. It's not the world you will remember, and your finances will not take you far. Is a wonderful line. It's an absolutely fantastic line to be like, yeah, you're not going to be this rich mogul that you were, and he still makes the choice because, and he says it, I want to live a real life. And so it goes back to this idea of what we said before about the thing that attracted him to Penelope Cruz was the real, this authentic, this idea of sincerity, and that's what he's looking for, and he finally gets to make that choice, and that's why it feels like a character arc, because he still makes that choice. He chooses the real over the fantasy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, and that could be underlined more by the film. It's not clear. I mean, we have said this about why he's attracted to Penelope Cruz and Sophia, but it could be underlined better in the film. But again, it works. You know, I mean, it's there if you look for it. And yeah, I mean, it's easy we can say, why this fetish for the real? Give me the, you know, I mean, it's the Matrix, right? The steak tastes real. You know, why this fetish for the real? We can say that, but it works as a character arc. It is, and ironically, it feels like more of a choice. Here, whereas in the first one, these things are just not there.
No, and it's another one where we say about, I wasn't interested in seeing, like, you know, Open Your Eyes 2. I wasn't bothered about what happens to Cesar in the real, like him making that choice. There's a part of me that wants to see what happens to David Ames when he wakes up. Like, all right, how does that play out? Because that's still interesting. There's still more for that character, because he is going to wake up 150 years, 200 years into the future. He's still disfigured. He's got this, like, yeah, there's a story to tell there. So it was just interesting. I thought, like, I'm glad we didn't see anything. I'm glad that he didn't wake up in like a techie room, but I'd be interested in that story.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that there is some ambiguity here. I mean, I think that both of us in both films feel like it's clear he's in a VR scenario. I mean, he, you know, wakes up 150 years later. We both think that's the case, and it seems clear to us. But hypothetically, he could open your eyes could be what he's being told by Sophia on the street, and he's just started the loop again. You know,
Yes.
all of this could, in theory, be, you know, a delusion, you know, at an earlier point in the narrative. I mean, there is at least some ambiguity, and I think ambiguity is potentially rich, even if this is not really an ambiguous ending.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. There is that possibility. But as we talk about endings, we're coming to the end. So really, so Julian, any final thoughts on Vanilla Sky?
I'm surprised how much this affected me, and maybe the older I get, the more I, while I'm still a smart grade A intellectual, I am more charmed by really having an emotional connection to a film and to those characters. And this, at times, not only is masterfully done, but can feel like a gut punch. And so for me, that's what was surprising and stood out. What about you?
No, the same. Like, you know, I remember watching this years ago when it first came out, and I was just like, oh, okay, I remember this. Having seen Open Your Eyes, if I'm honest, I wasn't expecting a great deal. Oh, it's a cruise vehicle. It's going to be a bit more fluffy. And I was very surprised to find out how much more this pads out the characters to make it more affecting. You know, like I actually care about them and their journey, than what they're actually bringing to the story. And so there are moments in this, as we say, they're real. Like it really does bring those moments, you know, and not in abundance, but in moments. So there are moments when it's just like you say, like a gut punch, where it just is like, yeah, that's it, and it makes it much more affecting in that way. But also in this, I think the story being padded out, and actually I think to some of the performances, makes some of the choices more common sense. Like they make more sense. Things happen. Like this idea of consequences seems more legit because the choices being made seem to be sensible for the most part. Like, you know, I understand why things are happening. So I honestly do think, you know, through this conversation, I did enjoy Open Your Eyes. I do agree. I think Vanilla Sky is a better film. I think it's a more well crafted version of this story. Some people some people are likely to disagree with us. Yeah. Interesting. I had a look on a couple of those aggregated sites. In none of them does Vanilla Sky beat out Open Your Eyes. I do think that it being first and, you know, in Spanish helps, because I think there's that thing of, like, you know, the original's always better, and also it's a foreign language film, so that gives it kudos, which I think is bullshit. But
yeah, if you're willing to see it in Spanish, you're more likely to be a little more patient. And
but I think this is a good experience and an interesting film. And also, I say, like, you know, this has actually driven some. We talk about the real conversation, like the, you know, authentic conversation between you and I on this podcast, and I hope, you know, people appreciate that.
And if you're a man listening to it, have emotions.
Yeah, well,
tell the people you love that you love them, and all the things that matter, because God knows how long you have.
Exactly. I honestly, you know, like say, you know, we obviously say about reach out to us to talk about these things, but, you know, it's difficult to reach out across social media. But what I am going to do, in the notes down below the show, I am going to put a couple of links into charities, mental health networks. You know, they're all discreet. They're all things. Just use them. If you're listening to this and this does ring true, or we've said anything that sort of, like, you know, has brought up any feelings, dude, we're there for anybody. Like, come chat to us. You know how much we like to talk. But if you want professionals or you want to talk to somebody, they're the people to talk to. So have a look below for the links. But more importantly, you know, than anybody's mental health, if you like the show, that's right. Not only am I caring about people's health, I'm a cheap whore when it comes to promoting things. Leave a review. Go out to go onto your podcast catcher. Leave a review for us. 5 stars, 4 stars. All feedback is appreciated. And come find us on social media at PodTime Space. We have got a lot going on
I think what you're saying is if you're suffering and you feel alone, the dopamine hit that you are going to get when you click like, when you click follow on @PodTimeSpace, when you give it that 5-star rating, you will just feel that dopamine flood your brain.
That's
and
right.
You will be born again.
Yeah, and if you if I tell you what, if you feel good leaving us a review, you're going to feel ecstatic when you join our Patreon. So come check that out. So that's patreon.com/20cg media, and there's all kinds of stuff on there. Julian and I talking through the Twilight Zone. I've got the podcast on there. There's all kinds of bits and pieces. So go check it out. But guys, as always, legitimately, if I will be serious on that. Check out those links below. They are very important. And to any, I am talking to the men out there. Like, we've all been there. If you do want to reach out, you do struggle. Like, there are people willing to listen. But anyway, Julian, thank you very much for this conversation.
It does get better. Remember, nothing is forever. And those dark nights, there's a day. And if the next day isn't that brighter day, maybe that brighter day is in 3 months or 6 months, and you can't see it or imagine it now. And I have to tell myself this routinely.
Yeah.
But
the only downside I'll say is that bright day probably won't include Penelope Cruz. Sorry. But we can all hope. But anyway, Julian, thank you very much.
Does your wife listen to the podcast?
Nope.
Okay. We're safe.
But yeah, Julian, thank you very much for the conversation today. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening along.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.